In this video, we'll learn all about the basics of pivot tables and advanced tools such as the slicer, timeline, pivot charts, and creating calculated fields. We have on screen our dataset. But to really show the power of pivot tables, we use a very large dataset with almost 1 million rows. You can press Ctrl and arrow key down to check, and Ctrl and arrow key up to go back to the top rows. You can download this file for free using the link in the description. By the way, this dataset is a fictitious sales data on the sale of anime character figures. I hope you're an anime fan as well. Now, let's jump into it. To start, as best practice, we need to convert our dataset into a table. To do this, we can click anywhere on the data and press Ctrl-T. On the pop-up window, make sure that the My Table Has Headers option is checked. If you prefer the long method, you can also find the table command under the Insert tab in the ribbon. Now, we are ready to use our data in a pivot table. Click anywhere on the table. Successively press Alt and V and T. On the window that will pop, click OK or press Enter. This will open a pivot table in a separate sheet. If you prefer the long method, you can check the Insert Pivot Table command under the Insert tab in the ribbon. The reason why we used a table instead of a range is that every time our data is updated, we don't need to manually change the data source of the pivot table. Data updating happens dynamically when the source is a table, but not when it's a range. Our pivot table is currently empty, but notice on the right side that we can see our pivot table fields. If you can't see it, you might accidentally click outside your pivot table or close the pivot table fields window. To show it back, simply click on your pivot table, go to Pivot Table Analyze tab on your ribbon and click on Field List. Using the field list, we can populate our pivot table with the different fields available from our dataset. Let's take, for example, we want to determine the total gross sales from our data. We can simply drag the gross sales field to the Values area. Notice that our pivot table shows a single number, which is actually the total gross sales in our data. We can also do this with the total count and the total discount. But as you can see, the numbers are not quite readable. To format it, we can highlight the cells. Right-click on it, then choose Format Cells. On the window that pops up, choose the number category. Put 0 in decimal places. Click on the box to use 1000 separator and click OK. Now, we can easily see that our gross sales are in the billions, the count in the millions, and the discount in the 100 millions. Next, what if we want to see the breakdown of these figures? Let's simplify first by removing the other data, and let's focus for now on the gross sales. To remove a field, we can drag them out of the Values area. Say we want to analyze the total gross sales in terms of branch. To do this, let's drag the branch field to the row area. Notice that our previous 4.6 billion gross sales are now broken down into 5 selling branches. But if you prefer, instead of showing the branches in the rows, we can show it as columns. To do this, drag the branch field from the row area to the column area. But we prefer the branches to be presented in the rows, so we'll drag it back to the row area. Our pivot table is looking great, but we don't necessarily know when these sales took place. So to add the date, we drag the date field to the column area. Now, we have a good-looking pivot table that shows our gross sales per branch per year. But what if we want to drill down a little further? And we want to know the best-selling products per branch, the category of those products at least. Let's drag the category field to the rows area just below the branch. Now, we are also able to see the product categories for each branches. Let's move on to the pivot table design. Click anywhere on your pivot table and go to the Design tab just beside the Pivot Table Analyze tab on your ribbon. We can see a bunch of commands. First, let's explore the pivot table styles. Click on the bottom right arrow. This will show up a lot of styles from a light to dark styles. In our pivot table, we'll be choosing the light one with a shade of green. Next design customization we can do is in the pivot table style options. In here, We can turn on and off the styling to the row and column headers. You can adjust according to your preference. We can also choose to show banded rows or columns. The final design customization we will discuss is the layout. In the first command, we can choose whether to show subtotals at the top, bottom, or not show subtotals at all. Before we move to the next command, let's make our pivot table smaller so we can see all data up to the bottom. We can do this by right-clicking on any part of the row label. Choose Expand/Collapse and click on Collapse Entire Field. Now, let's move back to the Grand Totals command. We have two sets of grand totals. Grand totals for the columns and grand totals for the rows. In this command, we can hide both the row and column grand totals. Show both row and column grand totals. Or show either one of the row or column grand totals only. To illustrate the next commands, we must expand our pivot table. We can do this just like how we collapsed the row labels earlier. But instead of choosing Collapse Entire Field, we choose the Expand Entire Field. Now that our pivot table is expanded, let's move on to the Report Layout command. We can choose between Compact, Outline, or Tabular Form Layout. Choose according to your preference. Furthermore, we can also choose if we prefer to repeat the item labels or not to repeat the item labels. Lastly, for the blank rows, we can choose to place a blank row between each row labels. As you can see, there is a blank row between Makati and Mandaluyong rows. Before we move on, let's first simplify our data by removing the categories. To group these dates, right-click on any date in the column label section and select Group. You'll see options to group by different time periods like months, quarters, years, and even days. For example, if we want to analyze sales by month and year, we'll select Months and Years and then click OK. Now look at that! Our dates are grouped by month within each year, and we can see the total sales for each period. This makes it so much easier to spot seasonal trends or compare performance month by month. If analyzing month is too long for you, you can try out by quarters. Let's try it out by repeating what we did earlier. And now, we're viewing sales data by quarter instead of month or day. Now that we know how to populate our pivot table with data, design and lay out our pivot table, and group dates, we will be discussing how to sort, summarize, and show the values of our sales data in various ways. First, since our pivot table is too long, we'll just group the dates by year. Now that our pivot table is looking neat, let's right-click on any cell containing our gross sales data. For this instance, we right-click on the grand total. Then choose Sort. This allows you to sort the figures from highest to lowest or lowest to highest. Next, we can also change how our gross sales data is summarized. As a default, it is summarized by adding all gross sales figures. Let's right-click on any cell containing our gross sales data. Choose Summarize Values By, and we can see that we have a bunch of options to summarize our data. First, we have the sum, which is the current summarization used. Next is the count. Instead of adding the figures under gross sales data field, it will only count the number of instances regardless of value. For average, this is the same as dividing the sum and the count. We also have other options such as min, max, and product, but we'll stick to sum for now because it's the summarization that makes most sense for our gross sales data. Aside from sorting and summarizing, we can also change how the values of our gross sales data is presented. Let's right-click again on any cell containing our data, then choose Show Values As. We will be shown a bunch of options. Let's try the first few ones. Let's click the percentage of grand total. Our figures will be shown as a percentage of the total gross sales, which is around 4.6 billion. Next, we have Show Values as percentage of column total. This way of showing the values might be useful when you compare the performance of each branch to each other in terms of gross sales. In the data, we can clearly see that the Quezon branch is performing 3 times better compared to the Makati branch. Next, we have the show values as percentage of row total. This one might be useful when you compare the performance of each branch over the years. Based on the data, we can clearly see that there is a significant decrease for all branches in gross sales in the year 2020, probably due to a pandemic. Now for our last example, we'll do a year-on-year growth analysis for each of the branches. Right-click, choose Show Value As, and click on Percentage Difference From. On the small window that appears, select Years from the Base Field dropdown and Previous from the Base Item dropdown. These values can easily show the year-on-year increase in gross sales for each branch. Notice that based on these values, we easily see that 2020 is a 50% decrease from the previous year, 2019. Also, we can spot a decreasing growth rate in the following years. This may indicate several factors such as increased competition, market saturation, or change in consumer behavior. Now that we can make sense of our data in terms of the big picture, let's learn how to direct our focus on certain fields of our data by filtering our unnecessary ones. We will learn 3 filtering techniques in this video. First, we'll use the basic filtering in the pivot table fields. Next, we'll use the timeline command to filter out dates. And lastly, we will use the slicer to intuitively filter data. Let's start with the first one. Before we move on, let's change our pivot table. First, for simplicity, let's remove all column fields. Next, suppose that we want to analyze the specific best-selling product. In this case, we will replace the branch field with description field. Notice that our pivot table is populated with all the anime character figures we sell and their gross sales for the 5-year period. Drag the branch field to the filter area. You can see that from cells A1 to B1, we are now able to filter specific branches. We can also select multiple branches. Let's try selecting Manila and Makati branch. Click OK, then you'll notice that the pivot table updated accordingly. Besides from the branch, we can also drag the date, so we can filter it by date. When you check the date filter, you will notice that it can be filtered by days. There might be an easier way to do this, right? Of course there is. Let's now discuss the second tool. The second tool we will use for filtering is the Insert Timeline command. Let's remove the date first from the filter area. To find the Insert Timeline command, go Pivot Table Analyze tab or use the shortcut Alt-JT-ST. On the window that shows up, check on Date, then click OK. In the timeline, we choose what periods must be covered by our pivot table. For this example, we'll be using quarters. Once set, we can easily filter part of the timeline by dragging the slider. Notice that as you finish dragging the slider, the pivot table automatically updates. Now we have an intuitive way of filtering dates. How about filtering other fields besides from date? That's the job for the slicer tool. Let's remove all filters first. Next, on your ribbon, go to Pivot Table Analyze tab, then click on the Insert Slicer command or use the shortcut Alt-JT-SF. On the window, we can select the fields we want to filter out. For this example, we'll be choosing the branch field and the category field, then click OK. Then let's reposition in a neatly fashion. To filter data, we can click on the fields. For instance, we want to know the sales made by the Pasig branch on the Attack on Titan category. Click on them and notice that the pivot table automatically updates. We can also see that the total gross sales made by Pasig branch for the Attack on Titan category in a 5-year period is 155.9 million. We can also select multiple items by holding down the Control key and clicking on the items. Say, we also want to see the sales for the One Piece category. Hold down Control key, then click One Piece in our slicer tool. Now our gross sales figure is 311 million. Note that the slicer tool can be used in conjunction with the timeline tool. Sometimes it might not be effective just to stare at numbers. Using PivotCharts, we can visualize our data from our pivot table and it automatically updates when our pivot table updates. Before inserting PivotCharts, make sure that our pivot table is currently selected or clicked. To insert PivotCharts, we can press the following keys successively: Alt, N, SC, and C, or we can click on Insert tab in our ribbon, then click on Power Pivot. On the window that appears, we can choose a bunch of options. We'll just use a column chart for now. In our pivot chart, if we want to show comparisons for branches, we can simply drag the branch field to our Legend Series area. We can also change the type of the chart. Say, I want to use a line chart instead. Make sure to click on your pivot chart, go to the Design tab, and click Change Chart Type. Choose the new chart you wanted, and click OK. Finally, you will notice that every time we change the filter in the slicer or the timeline, our pivot table and pivot chart automatically update. For our last topic, suppose that instead of using the gross sales, we want to use the gross income. In this case, inserting a calculated field will come in handy. To insert a calculated field, click on your pivot table. Next, go to Pivot Table Analyze tab and click on Fields, Items, and Sets. Then, click on Calculated Field. Or, we can use the shortcut, Alt, JT, J, and F. On the new window that pops up, let's name our calculated field as gross income. On the formula, we can create an expression by clicking on the fields below. Our complete formula should be gross sales minus discount, and the difference is multiplied by the margin, which is an average is 52%. Once done, click OK. You'll notice that the figures were significantly reduced. This is because, this time, we are measuring the gross income instead of the gross sales. Lastly, to delete a calculated field, we can go back to the Insert Calculated Field command. Let's use the shortcut, Alt, JT, J, and F. Next, click on this drop-down besides the calculated name combo box. Then, select the calculated field you want to delete. Lastly, click Delete and press OK. That's it. We've learned a bunch of things about pivot tables. If I've missed anything, let me know down in the comment. If you like it and want to learn more about Excel, don't hesitate to click like and subscribe. Thank you for watching.